This episode is sponsored by Medicine Based Beauty, where beauty is backed by science. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Cultivate CNY. I'm your host, Alex Canavan, founder of CNY Women's Network, and I am so excited for you guys to listen to this week's episode. This is the first time I am having a therapist on the podcast, which is honestly surprising because I love to go deep and I love to talk about relationship dynamics and emotional intelligence. So you guys are in for a treat. This week's guest is Lauren Ippoliti. She's the owner of Imago CNY. She's a licensed clinical social worker who specializes in relational work, EMDR therapy, and trauma. She's also advanced certified in Imago relationship therapy, which we'll get into in this episode and share a little bit more about that. In this episode, we talk about Lauren's journey to practicing Imago therapy. We talk about EMDR therapy, what it looks like and who it's for. And we also get into some effective communication strategies that can be applied to all kinds of relationships. We talk about intimacy, why relationships fail, and so much more. Without further ado, let's get right into the show. Lauren Ippoliti, welcome to Cultivate CNY.
Thank you.
This is my first episode with a therapist. Really, I'm surprised, honestly.
Yeah.
Really excited for today's conversation. I feel like we're going to get into some really good stuff here. So you specialize in Imago therapy with couples and EMDR therapy with individuals.
Yes.
So we're definitely going to get into relationships, couples therapy, all that later in the episode. But first, I want to start with EMDR. For anyone listening that has no idea what we're talking about, go ahead and explain it for us.
So EMDR is a trauma processing model. It stands for eye movement desensitization reprocessing therapy, which doesn't really matter in the scheme of things right now. But what it does is it helps move old trauma through. So kind of connect where you think about something, but you don't feel it in your body after a stressful or traumatic experience. It uses different methods than standard talk therapy to help it connect the body and the mind and process something through so it sits in history like the rest of our memories.
And what kind of people should maybe consider EMDR therapy, or at least what kind of people do you typically see coming to you for that?
I would say anybody can do EMDR. People need different levels of prep work. So to do it well, to do it deeply, we need to have what we call affect tolerance. So the ability to feel feelings fully, both challenging ones and positive ones. But beyond that, it can be useful for a variety of things. I've used it with trauma, obviously, but stressful experiences, challenges with relationships from childhood, adolescence, adulthood. I've used it with OCD, depression, anxiety, panic disorders, phobias. And it's really good for anything that you want help with in terms of performance for the future, too.
Okay.
So it can be used for so many different things.
Yeah.
I've also used it with substance abuse, too.
Exactly how does it work? Like what is the practice consist of?
I'm trying to think of the
Like
best way to
what does
describe
a
it.
session look like for EMDR?
So there's many different phases of EMDR. So a lot of times when people are talking about the actual processing phases, they're talking about phase 4 and up. So the earlier phases are about getting information, prep work, developing certain strategies that are specific to EMDR for soothing. But once you're in the processing phase, you are thinking about the memory that you're targeting or the issue. And it's like you're watching the memory on a screen. So you're not reliving it through the first person. You see yourself in the memory. And then you do what's called bilateral stimulation, which is we have a lot of different options for how to do it. So you're stimulating your brain rhythmically, left, right. And it was traditionally studied with eye movement, which is where the name comes from. So therapists can use their hands. We have light bars, different programs to do it remotely too. But there's also tappers, and you can self-tap. There's a lot of different methods. So you're thinking about it, doing the bilateral stimulation for a little while. The therapist stops and asks what came up. You tell them briefly, and then you go back to it, and you move it through. You see that the distress tends to come down. Sometimes it increases a little bit in the beginning, but then as it comes down, you then, once you get it to the lowest you can, you pair the new belief you want with the memory.
So there's a lot of does this open up space for neuroplasticity, or does it almost put the brain in a certain sort of brainwave so you can kind of initiate new belief systems?
Yeah, you need to be activated, but also, ironically, in your body. So present. And there's a lot of different, actually, there's different types of methods that can access it, these advanced protocols within EMDR that have learned different ways of processing it through as well, besides what I just described. It's just the standard protocol. But yeah, it helps create new neural pathways. There's been research done on humans afterwards and before EMDR, and they can see differences in the way their brains function and mental health.
Is EMDR a therapy that you can do over a long period of time, or is it really something that people come to you with a specific problem they need to conquer and deal with, and then kind of move on?
Both. Both are possible. It just depends on the history and what you're looking for. So I'll have sometimes someone will come in and want to do something very specific, like a car accident or
Mhm.
a traumatic delivery, labor. And we'll just do that and then they'll go. But other times we'll find early childhood stuff that is impacting the processing. Sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. We'll go back and do earlier things as well. I like to think about it as episodes of care. So people come in and do what they're looking for and then go on their way and move on. And sometimes they'll come back in and explore either a different layer of what they'd already worked on or something different.
What if someone is aware that they have a hard time feeling their feelings
Mhm.
and they know that there's some things that need to get hashed out? And probably the best method of action might be EMDR because it really does, it allows you to drop into the body and feel those feelings, right?
Mhm.
But they don't really know where to start. What if they're confused and they're not necessarily sure what needs to be addressed first, or even possibly maybe they don't even recall what needs to be addressed?
Right. Well, I personally do a combination of parts work with EMDR. So I'm not fully trained in IFS. I've done a lot of different training and reading with IFS and other part models. And so in that case, we help people learn how to feel the feelings, the different parts that protect you from doing it and intellectualizing it. And then we bring those parts into the processing. But we need to have, some people will do EMDR early on with that, but we find that when you build up different strategies with the different parts of the self, and also in supporting feeling comfortable, feeling feelings deeply, that EMDR is more impactful. You get deeper into success, essentially, moving things through in a deeper level. Doesn't mean you can't, but you can go deeper and have more impact the more that happens. And I mean, what you described is so common. I would say it probably describes almost every therapist that exists since we're really good intellectualizers, but it's just a common issue in our culture. So we usually assess for it in the beginning. Now, if someone has a repressed memory, we don't go digging for that because there's a reason the psyche doesn't remember something. It doesn't have enough trust in the safety of the system to allow for it. So if you push too much for that, you can have an increase in mental health symptoms.
Mm.
So we help nurture the system so that that can come forward if that's something that needs to happen.
What are some of the things that you recommend your clients do, even day to day at home, to start almost this new way of living? This new way of allowing their feelings to happen and processing events, in a healthy way instead of avoiding them and repressing them.
Yeah, I would say, every EMDR therapist does it differently. We all have kind of the different models we use. I use a combo of IFS, the therapy made by Dick Schwartz, and DBT, which is a mindfulness kind of advanced skills based model. So usually I give homework. I'm a big homework giver on how to practice these new things and find what works for people. Um, but, it makes me think about the question you asked before, too, in terms of how do you figure out where to start and what to do with EMDR. And I would say on that side, there's no homework to be given because we figured out in the session. That's like
Mm.
one of the one things that we'll do together and doesn't have to be done on your own.
Are you ready to take your career, connections, and professional growth to the next level? The 2025 CNY Women's Summit is just around the corner on March 7th, and this is your chance to be a part of an empowering day filled with inspiring speakers, interactive workshops, and meaningful networking opportunities. Early bird tickets have already sold out, but don't worry, standard tickets are still available. But here's the thing, they're going fast, and you don't want to miss out. So, as a thank you for being a part of our wonderful podcast community, we're offering you $10 off your ticket when you use the code Cultivate CNY at checkout. Don't wait. Head over to cnywomensnetwork.com/summit to grab your ticket today. And let's make 2025 the year of bold moves and big wins. What is it that makes us, anxious or depressed and kind of avoidant in addressing those feelings?
I think there's a lot of different issues that contribute to that. Um, One of the ways I look at that is a lot of times anxiety and depression are the result of other emotions not being felt fully. And it amplifies and turns into this other thing that takes a life on its own. Sometimes it's trauma being repressed and not dealt with and not being in the body and just moving on with life from your head. So the further you get disconnected from those feelings, the more they grow kind of behind the scenes. We also I think our culture is changing with how much people talk about mental health and therapy, but we have a culture where that's not a given, where we work on it. We know that it takes work. And I think that creates a lot of problems for us when we're too busy.
What led you to this work? What made you want to become a therapist in the first place?
When I was a kid, I knew I either wanted to go into mental health or music, and I struggled with deciding. But I initially picked music because that was a place where I was gifted. And I figured I should go use those gifts. And then when I got to music school, I was miserable. It was very confusing. And I just knew I wasn't in the right place, that I needed to shift to working with people. And when I first began doing that, I wasn't sure where I would specialize. I always had an interest in trauma based on my own experiences and those I saw around me, how critically impactful unresolved trauma is on the way you see the world, live your life, engage in relationships. But then I never saw myself as a couples counselor. I really had no interest in that. I thought that was really messy and just not my forte. But I was interested in relationships. So I used to run relationships groups and work from that perspective. But I ran into some challenges with my current husband and we started doing Imago Therapy. And then after a couple of sessions, the therapist suggested we go to a workshop. There weren't any local at the time. And I was like, I don't want to go to a workshop. Him and I were both going back and forth about it. He wanted to do like a workbook first on our own. I'm like, dude, as a therapist, I can tell you, like, it's not going to be it. But we did it, didn't work. So we went to the workshop. And the therapist we were seeing was like, Lauren, you can use it as a write-off. Who knows? Maybe you'll get interested in becoming an Imago therapist. I was like, there's not a chance that that's going to happen. And then that's exactly what happened. The woman we did the workshop with, I ended up training with, and then I did the workshop training with her. And now she's a mentor of mine. I got fully sucked in.
I mean, from the research I've done, it sounds like an incredible theory.
Mm-hmm.
For anyone who is not familiar with Imago Therapy, can you explain it for them?
Sure. Let me see if I can do the elevator pitch. The theory in Imago is that you pick a partner that is going to trigger the heck out of you. That, like, in typical kind of our cultural explanation is every relationship has challenges. But in Imago, it's that it's supposed to be there, that we pick a partner that's a mixture of positives and negatives of our childhood caretakers and influential people that also possess lost parts of our own. So things that we have shut down in us, they have, and that has similar wounding as ourselves. That's unknown, obviously. So that past the honeymoon stage, it matches up to create this friction where there's an opportunity for growth. So opposed to the standard model of like, how do we fight fair? How do we accept this? How do we move through this with healthier communication tools? Imago's concept is that if we move through this with the question of where do I need to heal? What are my wounds showing up? And what are the lost parts that's being called to grow within me from my partner? That we grow kind of leveling ourselves up and move through that conflict together and then move back into this romantic, real love stage.
Which builds a bond.
Deeply.
Yeah. And I could imagine that this method of therapy is just a lot more empowering and more abundant thinking than the traditional fight fair and accept. That almost seems like gritting your teeth to get through a marriage and to keep it going, which doesn't sound fun, right? Doesn't
No,
sound very effective.
no.
So when a new couple starts working with you, what are some of the questions you start asking them?
Well, in the beginning, I asked them, about the things that they find to be really enjoyable about the relationship, the strengths of the relationship, the things they desire that aren't there yet, um, the way they show up at their worst when they're reactive, and the vulnerable feelings underneath that. And usually, the way we show up at our worst is in opposition to the thing we desire. So we start to build the roadmap of where they're wanting to go and what needs to heal together. And then I teach them the Imago dialogue to begin talking differently in session so they can have that outside of session. But that's the main thing we use in session also.
So there's a dialogue with this therapy. Okay,
Yeah.
so you actually can give people real tangible tools to
Mhm.
apply to their lives,
Yep.
instead of kind of just using trust and hope
Yeah.
for applying these wonderful things that you do learn in couples counseling. What does some of the
It's all out there.
dialogue sound like? Is it fluffy and weird, or is it kind of just normal and common sense?
I think it depends on where you're at with it, what you think about it. Usually people report, not usually, sometimes people report that it's uncomfortable because it's a slower conversation and
Mm.
you're not used to looking, like sitting close to your partner and looking in their eyes and speaking to them slowly and being heard. So it can feel strange at first, but then once people make it their own, I find that people really gravitate towards it because it's how to have a conversation where you feel heard
Hmm.
instead of a conflict, or it's a conflict where you feel heard instead of an argument, really. And it turns into something that feels really life giving.
Yeah, because you're providing that kind of calm, safe space for people to be who they are instead of having to be on the defense
Right.
and maybe say things that they don't even mean, right?
Right.
Because it's a slippery slope once you get going.
Once you're activated, yeah, it's the only real way I know how to have conversation that's intimate, where you disagree and you don't have to agree with each other, but can still feel connected. I use it parenting too all the
I
time. I
was gonna
can't
say,
imagine parenting a teenager without this.
I feel like you could use it with your teammates too. I mean, this could
Absolutely.
be applied across all spheres of leadership, right?
And it is. There's a coaching side to the training too that is often used in business leadership. The therapists do it as well.
I think one of the hardest parts of business leadership is having those hard conversations.
Yeah,
Um, Maybe being a founder who needs to communicate your needs to your
absolutely.
team, and really not knowing how to do that because maybe you've never been able to communicate your needs. Maybe you were never
Right.
allowed to have needs up until this point, right?
Right.
And that can all be really confusing and really stressful for some people.
Hmm.
I don't know, maybe I'm projecting. And I really admire. It's so funny that you say I'm not familiar with Imago really at all. I
Hmm.
don't know what it sounds like or looks like, but it's funny that you say it's kind of a slower way of speaking. And the people that I've always admired the most in terms of how they communicate, they do speak a little slower.
Hmm.
They speak in a very calm, slow, easygoing way. And it's not like they don't seem like they're trying to prove a point at all. They don't seem like they're trying to convince you of anything.
Hmm.
They kind of have a lot of space to just listen to you and respond. You
Right.
can allow space
Not
for
listening to speak.
silence.
Right.
There's a lot of power in that.
Hmm.
And I'm sure for the people that you work with, they reported maybe feeling more powerful once applying this method.
Absolutely. Usually they feel some of the most frequent things I hear is feeling more connected, right? Instead of needing our partners to agree with us, we just need them to understand us.
Mm.
And the dialogue also helps you focus on yourself. So it helps you stay away from those, problematic strategies, the toxic conflict stuff that comes up. So then they really feel connected. And then they build trust. There's different languaging in therapist circles about creating safety in relationship, but I'm doing this training right now through to be a certified sex therapist. And Tammy Nelson, that I'm doing the training with, was talking about how what's really important is trust, that you're not always going to feel safe with your partner. Obviously, the basic emotional and physical safety needs to be there, but they're going to trigger you. They're going to be human and mess up, and that you need to trust that you can work through it together. And the dialogue creates that, because you have this safe space to have a dialogue that's complicated in a fairly straightforward format. The dialogue in itself is pretty simple. The practice of it's not easy, but it's easy to understand.
What are some of the things that people do that you think break down that trust?
I think it's just when we're feeling emotionally reactive. Like, typically when we're vulnerable, we have these protector parts that come out and try to rescue us that we learned when we were kids. Adaptations, protections, they're automatic and we don't realize they're happening. And they're the things that usually kept us emotionally safe as kids, but they're the exact thing that push our partners away.
Mm.
And they will trigger our partners just because of that that mashup that we've created relationally.
Why do you think we subconsciously choose partners that trigger us?
I know people ask me that all the time. Like, I didn't know they had this wound. I didn't know they were like this. And I'm like, I know. Like, I was skeptical about this whole model when I was first trained in it too. I was like, I don't know. This seems just like too kind of cookie cutter, but I see it constantly. And I mean, I think there's a lot of different frameworks for trying to understand that. Harville talks about how everything in the universe is always expanding, that we're looking for expansion and growth. And that seems to be what's happening relationally if we choose to be conscious, that we can become our best version of ourselves as a result of our relationship challenges. Unfortunately, I think if we don't do that, it's the opposite that can happen relationally. But yeah, the why is a great question that I think has a lot of different answers.
What do you think leads to just the breakdown of a marriage over time? I mean, I'm sure there's lots of things,
Mm-hmm.
but is there anything that sticks out to you or something that you see often in failed
I think it's
relationships?
getting stuck in the wounding, like
Mm.
being reactive and doing things to protect yourself that hurt your partner, not hearing your partner. I mean, there's obviously the big ones: untreated mental health, untreated substance abuse, domestic violence, but affairs are rampant. And I think that they also are an opportunity to do some like really, really beautiful couples work.
Mm.
Um, so, if anything, the couples I've seen that can't move through it or don't, it's because they've stayed in that bad place for a really long time. They come in really late and they've
Mm.
been disconnected so
Okay.
long that there's so much hurt. It's like scar tissue that gets in the way.
So there is such thing as too late. You don't want to wait too long
N-
to
No, and
get to the
then,
bottom of it.
right. And sometimes couples do work through that. So it's hard to know,
Hmm.
but the chances go down the longer you stay in that bad place.
Yeah, I could imagine if you do, push things to the side over time, it's kind of like, do you even want to love this person?
Right.
You know?
Yeah. You're
Do you
comfortable
even
in
want
your
to have a
armor.
beautiful relationship with this person or no?
Right. And sometimes people are more comfortable with that type of connection because that's all they know. They're not usually conscious of that, but
Mm,
sometimes that feels better than what they perceive to be nothing.
that makes a lot of sense too. Yeah. And you
Yeah,
could have two people with completely different ideas of what a good relationship looks like.
absolutely.
Some people might think it's just simply a partnership that serves each other and it's good enough. And then other people want something very emotional and passionate.
Hmm. Yeah,
Why do you think affairs are running rampant?
I think they've always been there.
They've always been there.
Yeah,
There's just now proof.
yeah. People get caught. People are saying it's not okay.
I honestly think though that monogamy is less common though. I mean, at least for my generation.
Hmm.
I feel like I remember growing up and just being a teenager or a young adult and just the casual dating and having a roster and
Hmm.
keeping your options open, and there's just been this culture of that,
Hmm.
almost like nobody's good enough ever.
Yeah, that can be a avoidance technique too. I mean,
Mm.
um, conscious non-monogamy works for many people.
Hmm.
I think that there's different sides to that. There's non-monogamy that's not conscious and consensual too. It seems like everybody's just trying to find how to feel good in connection, and it's hard.
Yeah, I also think just there's more access with the dating apps, probably.
Oh my gosh, yes. We have everything at our fingertips. I mean, people talk a lot about looking for compatibility, and there are certain things that we want to have aligned. Obviously, everyone's what they value in that is different, but compatibility is not what makes long-term successful, healthy relationships.
Mm.
Um, but I think that looking for that is a good way to avoid being in one, right? If we go too far with it.
So compatibility doesn't necessarily determine a long-term healthy relationship.
Mm-mm.
That's interesting, 'cause I guess you would think it does, right?
Right. You think it'd make it easier. I mean, I can say from my personal experience, and we talk about this at the workshops that I run, my husband assists me with, is that I got married young and early in my 20s and then was divorced in my mid 20s. And after that, I did a lot of healing work, personal growth work, and tried to really figure out how to date differently.
Mm.
And so I dated a bunch, and then I met my husband, who is very different than my first husband. And I thought, we're super compatible. This will be easy. We like all the same stuff. We like the same food, music, activities. We have aligned values. I mean, we have a lot of fun together. And then challenges came up that were different than my first marriage, but had a very similar feeling inside of me.
Mm.
Um, and so that was that piece where I was like, okay, I can work through this stuff with him. I mean, at the time, we didn't know that. Um, but it was still hard. So the compatibility piece is complex.
How can someone know if they are avoiding intimacy? Because I assume that a lot of people probably don't think they are, but they are.
Right. I think with like the same thing goes in any relationship challenge is instead of if you're blaming other people a lot, it's to look back at yourself and say, how am I contributing to this challenge? And then we'll find our stuff. What
Yeah.
is it that is getting triggered here? What's hard for me? What's my wound and what's my growth stretch? What do I need to look at moving into? Like, how do I contribute to this
Mhm.
difficulty that I'm facing?
What does avoiding intimacy typically look like? Like in an everyday in a regular relationship?
I think there's all different ways to avoid intimacy. I mean, we can avoid intimacy by just being really angry and blaming
Mm.
because those emotions are not vulnerable, and that's where intimacy lies. We can avoid intimacy by just not having hard conversations. By when couples just don't argue, that can be avoiding intimacy. Or just there's a lot of different things in between.
Probably brushing things off, acting like things aren't a big deal.
Minimizing for sure.
Why do we avoid intimacy? What's so bad about it?
I think that a lot of us haven't seen great ways to do it. We haven't seen it go well. So we're just trying to find a way to maintain connection, thinking like,
Mm.
"Oh, this is good enough. This is the best there is." Or just not having the skills because it is really hard. Right? There's a lot of great therapy models out there that do really good work. I love EFT. I love Terry Real's relational life model. Um, and Imago offers this practice that is unique in the way that it helps you do those things. Um, that feels very connecting when they're hard conversations.
When a hard conversation does come up, what are some communication techniques or strategies that we can keep in mind just to avoid a breakdown of the conversation or maybe even the relationship?
I mean, I would love to teach like the full dialogue, but one piece of it that can be accessible is what we call mirroring. So reflecting back what you're hearing your partner say does a couple of things. It helps you not be defensive and plan your response. It helps you regulate. And if you regulate, your partner then can co-regulate with you and slow things down. You have to do it from a stance of genuine curiosity. It can't be, it has to be authentic, otherwise it can be felt. So you say essentially, what I'm hearing you say is, and you reflect back what they were saying or what you think they're saying. And then you say, did I get you? It can't be, is that right? It's got to be, did I get you? Am I hearing you
Mm.
genuinely? If they say no and they say something back, you continue to mirror until you get it. And then you say, is there more? Nobody ever asks us when someone's upset, like, tell me more about what's happening. So it's this really kind of gift of showing, like, I really care about you. I care about what's happening. I want to hear more. And then in that process, when you're asked that, you go inwards and say, like, what else is there about this? right? And you can go back and forth and calm things down and get to the crux of what's going on. And I would also say validation. People misunderstand that validation is, they don't realize it's not agreement. I can validate what someone's thinking about, how someone's feeling, their perspective, their experience, without agreeing with their objective reality.
Mhm.
And so when we validate, we can say to our partner, it makes sense to me that you're upset about this, knowing you as I know you, that you felt like when this happened or I did this, that you thought that. I mean, that must have been really hard. And then we can switch sides.
How do you have that compassionate disagreement with someone, even if it isn't your partner? Maybe if you are trying to talk to someone on your team
Mhm.
that maybe they're not okay with something you said as the leader, right?
Right.
So you need to have that conversation with them and make sure that you hear them and validate them, but you still need to kind of stand your ground,
Hmm.
and communicate your needs as well.
Absolutely. Well, and I think that that's why this is so powerful is that sometimes we find validation to be minimizing than our stance, and it doesn't. One of the biggest tenets in Imago therapy is you can either be right or you can be in a relationship, that there's going to be difference, right? And sometimes in relationships, there's a power differential if you're a boss, if you're a parent, right? So I can mirror and validate and get curious about my daughter's stance all day long, but certain rules are just going to stand. Certain things are just a no, certain things are just expected. Um, but I could still do that with her. And then when it's done, I can reinforce what the expectation is. It
Yeah.
might be different and I might communicate it differently, but yeah, it has room for both.
What do you think some of the most successful relationships you've seen, like what do they make sure they continue to do for each other?
They need to add in the positive. So there needs to be regular experiences together where they're appreciating each other, having gratitude for each other, having fun together, having connection in a variety of ways. We need to have positives outweigh the negatives. That doesn't mean in like a toxic positivity type of way where you're ignoring negatives, but we need to make sure we nurture the relationship and feed it. People sometimes talk about falling out of love. Drives me a little bonkers sometimes because I'm like, long-term relationships, you don't stay in this state of limerence or this state of, kind of you're high in love. You'll go in and out of it in different ways, but you have to take care of it. Otherwise, it dies.
What do you think people are actually looking for? The people that end up maybe leaving most relationships because they feel like there's something missing and maybe there's not enough love or passion or romance or intimacy for them. Are they choosing the wrong partners or is there something that maybe they're doing?
Imago would say that we need to make sure we look at our side of the street and that work to be done is going to be done with whatever partner you meet, that kind of wherever you go, there you are, and your
Mm.
stuff will come up. I take the stance that's a little bit different than Imago at times, which is I think it's important for people to be happy and they have the right to say this relationship doesn't work for me anymore. There's obvious cases when that would happen, and Imago agrees with that in terms of cases of domestic violence, untreated or undertreated substance abuse and mental health. But when you're working together for a long time and you know what your side of the street is, you know what your wounds are that are coming up, you know what your lost parts that are being called forward are, and maybe your partner's not meeting you there, or too much has happened, too much water's under the bridge, um, then it's time. Sometimes people decide it's time. It's not my job to say when it's time, but that makes sense to me.
I would imagine that even though people are coming and trying to go to therapy, sometimes there's just the relationship simply not working. Where do most people have to get to realize that it's not working anymore?
Well, I think um, the big ones are untreated substance abuse and mental health. Those are dead
Yeah.
ends for getting connection together. And then obviously, when there's domestic violence, I think in our culture, we inappropriately prioritize physical violence and emotional and verbal violence as an ongoing power and control dynamic is a dead end, also. Other than that, the murkier areas, I think, really just depends person to person. And the big thing is to get clear on your own stuff first. because it will be there when you go, and some of the idea is if you don't do your personal work and you leave, you might just pick a lateral partner, different set of issues, same level of functioning in the relationship. If you do your own work and level up, you might level up your relationship, but you're still going to meet your stuff.
You mentioned before that when you left your first marriage, you started dating and you were dating in a different way. What did dating look like for you when you were, I'm assuming that you were probably dating more intentionally. You wanted to have
Some of the time
fun.
I wasn't. Yeah, I was still young.
That's okay.
Trying to figure it out. Yeah, I was trying to find, how do you have a healthy partnership? What are the rules for making that? I was very much looking at other. I had kind of this idea that my picker was wrong, and so I needed to fix how I picked a partner. And that wasn't it completely. There were pieces of that were true. I needed to focus more on what my work was and what I was attracting and why.
Yeah, I was just about to say that.
Yeah.
It's most of the time you can't really worry about who you're going to pick next. You need to first worry about, okay, sure, you might have this ideal partner in mind, but how are you going to attract that person?
Right.
And what is it about you that has been attracting these types of partners?
Exactly.
How does if someone isn't necessarily naturally self-aware, or maybe naturally, they don't take a lot of ownership naturally. Maybe they tend to blame others or see fault in others. How can someone start to uncover some of their own issues on their own without therapy?
I would say getting really curious about when you're blaming what's underneath it, right? I'm blaming this person because I'm scared of what, right? Or what I feel in my body when this happens is what I don't like about this, what I'm concerned, the story I tell myself. You can journal around it. There's lots of good reading to do. There's a ton of books by Harville Hendricks about Imago Therapy, Terry Real, the parts work. No Bad Parts is a great book for that. And just really being present with the self and getting curious.
I think the hardest part is being present with the self. A lot of us pick up some habits or vices or behaviors that are literally so we don't have to be present in the mind and in the body.
Yeah.
I know that you've worked with people in EMDR with some OCD or maybe some substance use issues. How does EMDR help people like that?
It really excavates the thinking patterns underneath it, along with the body sensations and the urges and the desires. So it helps to move through. It makes me think of kind of the supercharged metabolizing of your experience to help it shift into what you want it to be. Um, it's such a funny experience that I can explain all the steps and what it looks like, but when I have a client that hasn't done it yet, trying to explain it to them, and it was similar for me when I first got trained and had done it myself, explaining it to my friends. I was like, you kind of have to experience it. It's hard to explain, but it helps to really digest the stuff that's stuck and dysfunctional.
Do you think that
And move through.
there's often things that are stuck, especially for people that might have maybe their addiction isn't derailing their life, but it is this low vibrational, consistent addiction that they just can't knock, like vaping. There's a lot of that happening, especially with teenagers
Younger
too.
folks, yeah.
How does someone move on from that addiction, especially with EMDR?
Right. Well, the stance I take is that those parts have been created within yourself to help manage emotions, thoughts, challenges, right? They're negative coping strategies. So we can't just eradicate them. We have to help replace them in addition to moving some of these deeply held beliefs that need to get rewired. So it's a gentle process. It really makes me think about, especially when we're talking about feeling feelings more deeply and being in our body more and learning new ways. It makes me think a lot of exercise or weightlifting or Couch to 5K, this program that's really gentle and slow. You don't start out running miles and miles if you've never run before. It's too fast. So it's like dipping your toe in the water and learning new ways of gently supporting yourself in shifting some of these practices and then doing the processing to help really build new neural networks, ways of thinking, creating new muscle memory.
Obviously, if someone's vaping, right, to manage emotions, negative emotions, or we're seeing a lot of cannabis use for this as well. What thought patterns do you think are associated with those habits? Is this like this bottomless pit of just simply not feeling worthy or not feeling good enough? Is it a self-esteem issue? Is where could this what are these feelings of dis-ease?
They vary, but not good enough is a common one, or I'm not safe, or it's my fault. There's these themes, these different categories, even with the what they call the negative cognition and the positive cognition in EMDR. They get rooted back down to oftentimes the way we made sense of things when we were younger or along the way, that just get deeply ingrained. The more they get believed, the more they get reinforced historically.
Mm.
And so it's some thought that makes us feel bad about either our safety in the world or ourselves or our abilities.
Just simply feeling like you're inherently bad or there's something inherently wrong with you. Do you work with people with personality disorders or no, not necessarily?
I have historically, I wouldn't say that that is my specialty anymore. I did for a long period of time. I do think those terms get way
Mm.
overused. In an attempt, I think, of our culture to be more mental health focused, to understand things, we tweak stuff,
We
right?
want
Like,
to like label everyone
yeah,
as and
yeah,
act like we have everyone figured out.
right. And everyone's got a borderline side or a
Yeah.
narcissistic part, right? When that is your primary method of engaging in the world and it causes problems across contexts, that's more, work, family, health, all sorts of different areas, then that's something to look at. But I mean, borderline personality disorder is essentially just PTSD.
It's an attachment disorder, right?
Right. And it used to be like used as name calling in mental health,
Mhm.
essentially.
Yeah.
Therapists wouldn't work with it. But now that we know what it is, it's just somebody trying to get through managing a lot of pain.
Mhm.
And there's different levels of it, obviously, that need different levels of care.
Where do you I mean, so right now you're actually not accepting new clients. You are booked and busy, my friend.
Yes.
So, do you see the business expanding in 2025? Are you going to look into maybe developing out a team so you can take on more people?
I've played around with that idea. We'll see. I am helping do trainings in Syracuse with Imago Therapy because I want to have a team. I want to have
Mhm.
people to send these referrals to and people
Yeah.
to do group consultation with and really just get this model that I think is so impactful out in the community and available more. But yeah, maybe down the road, I've thought about doing something more of like a co-op model. Um, but we'll see what develops down the line. I tend to take on a little bit too much, so I'm trying to
Yeah.
slow
I was going to
down.
say good for you for knowing your limits.
Yeah, it's gotten better. I don't know that I've mastered that one yet.
You can tell when someone's done their work when they start to say no.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I've started to finally say no. But
It's hard.
still have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, it's hard, right? That's a different type of addiction. I've definitely done
Yeah. Yeah.
too much training, too much work, too many projects.
Do you think like we're all kind of just wired to be susceptible to these different addictions and obsessive, almost compulsive tendencies? Do you think that this is just how humans are wired and maybe we're all a little OCD in a way? We just have to do the work so we can manage?
I personally think it's a lot more to do with our culture.
Mm.
We have generations and generations of trauma in different ways that gets passed down and not talked about, and that affects our genes for sure. But we also have a culture where people are so isolated and lonely and not in community, doing and busy and all these different ideals about obtaining things that I don't think are necessarily good for us. They push us to the limit. And that's when we're going to develop these different coping strategies that are negative. Overworking, like we were just talking about, is really valued in our culture. When I've done some of the most unhealthy levels of overfunctioning, people will be like, "Wow, Lauren, look at all
You're
you're doing. You're doing wonderful." And
you're
I'm like
praised for
dying on
that.
the inside.
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. It's like, oh, actually my soul is
Yeah.
falling apart right now.
Yeah,
I'm not doing well.
yeah.
Yeah, no, especially if anyone's listening that is a leader, maybe they just started a business within the past couple years, very new. They're in that grind
Hmm.
part of their lives,
Yeah.
but they don't want to get swallowed up by it. They want to come out on the other side, build something really impactful, and still be a whole person.
Hmm.
What would you recommend they make sure they're doing while they're building this thing?
I think doing your own work in whatever form that might be, whether it's with a therapist, a coach, a program, knowing where your challenges lie within yourself, knowing where your wounds lie, because a lot of people will kind of just white knuckle that through. That creates a lot of additional friction and challenges for yourself instead of being fully in the moment with yourself, with all your good and all your bad. Makes it hard to cope with the stressful things.
If someone does want to get into therapy and maybe they want to work with someone like you, but you aren't accepting new clients right now, how should they go about finding a good therapist, a good match?
I think it depends on what they're looking for, right? Like if you're looking to do trauma processing, I think it's really important to work with a therapist that's fully trained in a model for trauma processing. Not that other modalities or therapists without that aren't good at all. That's great for prep work. But to do the deep trauma processing, I think it's important to find somebody that's fully trained and to make sure that you feel comfortable with them, that there's a balance in therapy of feeling safe, supported, heard, and seen, but also being pushed and finding that balance together.
Do you think it's smart for people to have someone explained, someone who's like in the coaching space,
Mhm.
they work in a nonprofit and they provide coaching services.
Mhm.
They explained therapy is kind of like looking at the past and life coaching is like looking at the future. Um, what do you think about that? Do you think that the therapy you're doing is setting people up for the future?
Yeah, I would say some therapy is about looking at the past, but not all. Um,
Probably talk therapy is a lot of the
yes.
past, right?
If you're trying to do standard talk therapy and make sense of things in an analytical way,
Mhm.
then a lot of times you are looking at the past, sometimes the current. But both EMDR and Imago look at the past and the present and the future.
Mm.
So it's how do I want things to look in the future? And there's a lot of planning with different tools around that as well.
Yeah,
It's
which
active.
much more holistic sort of route to take.
Yeah.
You also mentioned that you are getting certified in sex therapy?
Yeah, I
Okay,
am.
what's that process like?
It's a long process that I
Yeah?
have been evaluating. Yeah, I wasn't originally setting out to do that. And then when I started doing the couples work, sex kept coming up all the time.
Mhm.
And there was very minimal, if none, really, training in that. I'd always been comfortable talking about sex and had done kind of been the therapist that people would come to and ask me questions when sexual issues would come up in therapy. So I was like, oh, I'll go do some additional training. I'll start with some supervision, consultation groups. And then it turned into, okay, I'll take this course. And now I'm like, well, it's a funky area. So I want to be fully certified.
Yeah. So you can speak on it and help
Yeah.
coach them through.
Yeah. And I'm maybe long term do training for local therapists, but I'm not sure. I think I'm like 5 years in right now, 4 years in the
Wow.
training. Yeah.
Wow, how long is the training?
It depends on your own pace with
Okay.
it. So I think I've got maybe another 10 months left and then I'll be certified. I'm not sure. It's a extensive process. It's a lot more
Mhm.
than I had expected
Wow.
initially. Yeah.
Wow.
I think they just want to make sure it's very professional and it's complicated because it involves a lot of different body systems and information related to the physical side when there's challenges, as well as working with couples related to the run of the mill.
If someone is experiencing some sexual intimacy issues in the relationship, what's the first step they take?
In terms of therapy,
Um, maybe within the relationship.
I think talking about it, making sure that you can have hard conversations. You know, the old model of couples therapy is that if you resolve the issues in the relationship, then the sexual issues will resolve. And that's not always the case. Sometimes the dance around sex is very different than the typical dance around conflict because there's so much gunk in our culture around sex and
Mhm.
gender and
Yeah.
shoulds and identity. And so if you can't talk about it, you can't resolve it. And I would say that that's a starting place. And it's hard to talk about, but really important. And if you can't do it alone, get help.
What do you think can lead to a breakdown of the sexual relationship within a marriage?
I mean, I think
So many
that
different factors at play, of course.
absolutely some of it is just people not having information about what happens to the body when you age
Mm.
and how what's normal and what's not. I mean, that's some of the questions I've gotten the most about like, is this normal? And honestly, in my training, I have learned so much that I didn't know that should be common
Mm.
knowledge.
Okay.
So I would say that's one of them. The other thing is, um, if there's issues in the relationship that aren't being moved through, it will often, not always, but often affect sexual dynamics. And maintaining chemistry over time is complex too.
How can people maintain that chemistry? By simply being able to talk to each other, I'm sure is the
Some of it's talking and some of it's actually not. Some of it's making sure there's curiosity and fun and intrigue and desire. There's a lot of different ways of stoking desire and connection that's very individual, person to person. Um, and yeah, sometimes there's so many different pieces. Depends on the relationship.
how often do people come into therapy once sex is the issue? Do a lot of the people wait until sex is the issue and then I feel like that might be an assumption that we all have of couples therapy. Either we're assuming you're going to therapy because there was an affair
Mm-hmm.
or you're going to therapy because you haven't had sex in like 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see that a lot? Is that a true assumption or not necessarily?
I think, the my practice is interesting because it goes through ebbs and flows with different types of issues that come in. I'm always
I
curious
feel
how
like you
much,
can learn a lot about culture and society from being like a
right?
couples
Yeah,
therapist,
maybe. I've wondered about that. Like, is this represent what's going on in the world, or does
like
this have something to do?
sociology or
Right.
something.
But it also might be something to do with what I'm attracting in the practice,
Mm,
the way I market, my
yeah.
language, who knows, too. But yeah, I see a lot of both of those. I also see a lot of couples where, in terms of sexual issues, where one partner wants to have sex more frequently than the other one. That's a common
Mhm.
presentation in counseling. And then I also keep seeing more and more younger folks that are coming in to prepare their relationships before they run into challenges, which is just such a gift.
Yeah, that's like a new thing now.
Yeah. Oh,
People are
thank
taking
goodness.
preventative measures with couples counseling.
Yeah.
We've come so far, haven't
It's
we?
really, that's what with the workshop I find. People wait and wait and wait until it's at a fever pitch, except for I'll have younger couples that'll come in early on.
I think that that's kind of just human nature. We just featured Lindsay Mastro, who just started an HR agency
Oh, neat.
at one of our recent networking events, and she said, unfortunately, most of our clients come to us
Crisis.
once they're in a crisis, and that's when they come and seek out our services. It's just human nature to
That's when
procrastinate.
you're uncomfortable. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, how can people check you out and get in touch with you, Lauren?
They can find me on my website at Imago, IMAGOCNY.com. I try to keep it up to date with all the offerings and workshops. I'm running a new workshop with individuals also that's on there, along with the trainings for therapists, and my email and my phone number. Call, email, anyway.
We love that. And really quick, what do your workshops look like? Your wonderful couples workshops.
The couples workshops are a weekend. So, full day Saturday and Sunday, and a couple hours Friday night. And we do a lot at these workshops. Um, they say it's somewhere between 6 and 8 months worth of couples counseling in the workshop, although it's hard to estimate because there's things we do in the workshop that I don't do in the couples room when it's just a couple and I. They're really impactful and profound. So we teach people how to do the dialogue on a lot of different types of the dialogue, how to have appreciative conversations, gratitude, loving connection, how to talk through conflict in a variety of different ways with the dialogue. We help couples build a vision for their relationship, draw connections with the past and how it impacts the present, looking at their Imago profile, um, a lot of different practices for building connection and fun. And what we do is essentially we do a lecture, show a movie, a clip, talk about the next dialogue, have a couple volunteer to demo the dialogue. If they don't, my husband and I do it. We get feedback and then they all go and do breakouts and we talk about it.
That sounds like so much value in one weekend. Where does this take place? Is it like an overnight sort of retreat or do people just drive in every day?
Most of them are in Syracuse. So, a lot of people drive in. Sometimes I've had couples stay at hotels so they don't have to go back to taking care of kids and regular life stuff.
Yeah.
And then once a year, I run one up at Great Camp Sagamore in Racket Lake that's retreat style in this beautiful location where there's meals provided and it's historic and just really peaceful.
It's nice to just get outside of your environment and just go all in, something like that.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's easier to really stay in it and get more out of it in that way. But the weekends here are great as well.
So the couples retreat sounds like an incredible experience. What about the singles retreats?
Yeah, so they're called Keeping the Love You Find and Finding the Love You Want to Keep. It was a book written by Harville that was originally it was written for singles, but what he did was put all the advanced Imago material in it. And so now we run the workshops for individuals. So you can either be partnered up, but you come solo, or you can be single and come to this workshop. And you do a lot of exercises similar to the couples workshop in terms of the mode and the format we do it, but different, more advanced practices for getting to the root of how you show up in a relationship, what you attract and why, what needs to heal, and doing that work together in a group of people. That's really pretty powerful.
Well, Central New York is certainly lucky to have you. We just need more of you, right?
Yes, that's what
Because
we're working on.
there's a high demand, clearly. You're doing really amazing work for couples in Central New York. So
Thank you.
thank you for everything that you do. You're a breath of fresh air, and thanks for joining me.
Yes, thanks for having me.
All right, guys, that is it for this week's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in to Cultivate CNY. If you enjoyed this episode, I would love it if you left us a review and make sure you're subscribed to the show. Speaking of the show, if you know anyone or if you are interested in being our next guest on Cultivate CNY, be sure to submit us an application. You can just click the link in the show notes. And if you're a business owner that's interested in getting in front of our audience, you can go ahead and email us at podcast@cnywomensnetwork.com to learn more about sponsorship and advertising opportunities. All right, that's it for now. I'll catch you guys next Monday.